This may be my filthiest piece yet. It looks like it's been in a very wet place for a long time. There's lots of mold and mildew. The bottom of the legs have rotted out. It's hard to even tell what kind of condition the top is in through all of the mold and gunk. Any metal parts on it were rusted. But despite all of this, I felt that it could still be saved and was worth saving. The first thing I did was to clean it. I started by putting a mask on, taking it outside, and brushing it off with the broom to try to get as much of the mildew and mold off. And then I washed it down. And I got a little help from the rain. After I had cleaned off the top a bit, I could see that there were a lot of marks on it, and many of them were going across the grain. And that's really the worst kind you can have, because they're the hardest to get out. Or maybe it's better to say they're the hardest to hide. If you have a scratch in the top that's going with the grain lines, and you can't get it out, it's not going to stand out nearly as much as one that's going across the grain. So at this point, I was hoping I'd be able to get these marks out, or else I might not be able to save the top. And then I disassembled the table. This table was held together with screws and bolts. It wasn't glued together, so that made it really easy to get apart. This apron was broken in a couple of places, but thankfully they were clean breaks and I'd be able to glue them back together later on pretty easily. Once I had this all disassembled, I put all of the metal parts into some vinegar to help remove the rust. And I would leave them in there for a few days. The legs were made of 2 pieces of wood that were glued together, and the glue joint on a couple of the legs was coming apart. So on this leg, I used a wedge to break those 2 pieces apart so I could reglue them. Once I had them apart, I could see that there was very little glue left in there, but there was a little bit, so I just scraped that off with a scraper. And then I applied some new glue. And I rubbed the 2 pieces together for a bit. This helps to get the glue kind of tacky so that the 2 pieces won't slide around as much when I clamp them. and then I clamped it up. This was a little tricky to clamp, but I got it eventually. This leg was also coming apart, but it wasn't coming apart the whole length of the leg. So I didn't take the whole thing apart like the other leg. Instead, I just opened it up a bit with the wedge and got a glue syringe and shot as much glue as I could in there. And I used a piece of thread to help move the glue all the way down as far as I could. And then I could clamp it up. And while I had the glue out, I also glued this apron back together. For the small piece, I used some super glue because it was so small and it would be difficult to clamp. So with the super glue, I wouldn't need to clamp it because it dries so quickly. For the larger piece, I used wood glue because this piece would be easier to clamp together. The legs had lost a lot of wood on the bottom from rot. They were probably sitting in a damp place for a long time. I was initially going to rebuild them with some epoxy putty, but then I found in my stash of spare parts a leg that was almost identical to these legs, except that it was shorter. But it looked like the same kind of wood, had the same kind of finish on it. It was probably from the same manufacturer. So instead of using epoxy, I decided to use some of the wood from the spare leg to glue on to the bottom of the rotten legs to rebuild them. First thing that I did was to cut off about 1.5 inches on the bottom of all of the rotten legs. And then I cut off 4 1.5 inch slices from the spare leg. I then drilled a hole in the bottom of the legs and also into the new wood so that I could glue a dowel in there to help keep the two pieces together when I glued them up and to give it some extra strength. And then I could glue them up, clamp them, and set them aside to dry. While I waited for the glue on the legs to dry, I started removing the old finish from the top, or what was left of the finish. There wasn't much, but there was some here on the sides, but it was a very thin layer of finish. I started by scraping it off, and then sanded away whatever was left. And while we're talking about the top, we can take a look at the construction. The core of it is plywood. You can see the plies of the plywood here on the side. And that has a walnut veneer on the top. And then on the bottom, it has some solid pieces of wood going all around the perimeter. On the top of the top, there was barely any finish left at all, so I just went straight to sanding it to see how well I could clean it up. Here I'm wetting it down with some water so we can get a better look at the condition of the veneer. And it's pretty obvious that there are two big rings in the middle of the table. And there are those cross-grain scratches that I had mentioned earlier. I wanted to try and get rid of those rings with some oxalic acid. Oxalic acid works really well at removing dark stains left by water. I'm not sure what made these stains, but it was worth a try. So I applied some oxalic acid to the whole table. Once it had dried, it really hadn't done anything to those rings. They were still visible. And the cross-grain scratches were still there. The only option that I had left to remove those scratches and the rings was more sanding. But if I did that, I knew I'd sand through the veneer. So I decided at this point to just put some new veneer over the top. Before I put the new veneer on, I first sealed the surface with some shellac. I had a big roll of walnut veneer left over from a previous project, so I decided to use that for the top. I just cut out a piece that was a little oversized so I could trim it down after I got it on. And this is peel and stick veneer. So you just peel off the paper and press it down. If you enjoy watching my videos, please consider joining my Patreon. Patreon is a way that you can help support what I do while gaining access to exclusive videos and updates that aren't available on my YouTube channel. I'll put a link in the video description if you'd like to check it out. Thanks. Once the veneer was on, I used a router with a bit that has a bearing on it, and the bearing rides along the side of the top, and it cuts the veneer flush with the side. But I did have to go back after using the router to trim off just a little bit by hand, because the side is just a little bit curved, so the bit couldn't get the veneer completely flush with the surface. So I had to do that by hand, and I just used a utility knife. In the meantime, the glue on the legs had dried, so I began shaping the new feet. I started by chiseling off as much of the wood as I could. And then I moved to a belt sander to remove some more. And then finished it off by hand. And I was really happy with how they came out. There would be a seam visible on all of the legs where the new wood meets the old, but if they all have the same mark, then it's not a defect, it's a design feature. The new veneer that I put on had a really nice grain pattern, but I found the color to be a little pale. Here I'm wetting it down with some water just to show what it would look like with a clear finish on it. So to warm up this veneer a bit, I mixed up some dye stain. I took some of this trans tint dye and mixed it with water. I used brown and amber dye and just kept adding each until I got the balance that I liked. And then I wiped it on to the veneer. But before I wiped on the veneer, I did thoroughly wet the veneer down with some clear water and let it dry in order to raise the grain. And once it was dry, I sanded down the raised grain with some 180 grit sandpaper. If I hadn't done this, then when I applied the water-based dye, that would have raised the grain and made it kind of rough and fuzzy, which I would then have to sand smooth. But if I did that, then I would risk going through the color that I just applied. So I avoided that by wetting it down and sanding it smooth before I applied the stain. I also used dye stain on the legs and the aprons. They also had a nice grain pattern, but overall the color was pretty light, lighter than the top. But they did have a bit of a yellowish amber color to them already, so I used just a straight brown dye stain this time. I didn't add the amber because it was already in the wood. I think the wood used for these parts is butternut. Butternut is also known as white walnut. The grain pattern looks really similar to walnut, but the overall color is a lot lighter. But when you give it a little bit of color with stain, then it can look a lot like walnut. Once the stain was dry, I sprayed on some satin lacquer, clear lacquer, onto all the pieces. And then all I had to do was reassemble the table. And here you can see the hardware after I had been soaking it in the vinegar for a few days. It did a great job of removing most of the rust. And here it is, all finished. Thanks for watching.